Okay, this is like part three. I had to break that last one into two, and I might have to break this one into two. So here we go. Now we're going to look at that part of your system that is specific, that also gives you that thing called immunity, which means the second, third, fourth, fifth time this same bad guy comes around, you're going to beat it so fast that you don't even get sick by it. And that's what basically that's what immunity is. And that is due to the specific part, not the inflammatory response, not the non-specific part. That's due to the specific part. And this immunity can be due to natural things happening or things that we humans have done, which we would call artificial. And then we can also call it active immunity or passive immunity. So we're going to put those four words together in all the ways it can be put together. So here's what happens very naturally. You get a disease, and when you get a disease, you make a bunch of memory cells. You also make a bunch of antibodies. They're the right shape to latch on to that bad guy, but really the power is in these memory cells. You have so many more of them now that are programmed, so to speak, that have the right receptors for that particular bad guy. Since getting a disease is a natural process, and your immune system has been activated, kicked into gear. That's why we call this natural active immunity. Okay? But then we humans learned that you don't have to get sick to become immune. Because if you, now I'm going to pretend this is a bad guy, right? And these are its antigens. If you take a bad guy and you somehow weaken it or kill it so it can't infect you, but it still has these things that you recognize, your white blood cells recognize, then your immune system will be kicked into gear, active. But since we humans kind of orchestrated this, we call this artificial active immunity, and we call it vaccination, right? And we call that thing a vaccine. So, what must a vaccine have in it? The antigen molecules, right? And with bioengineering, we've even been able to make some vaccines by just making those antigen molecules without even having any other part of the bad guy in there. So there's no chance you're going to get sick. So here in graph form, here's what happens when you just naturally get sick. Your first exposure to the bad guy that has what they call antigen A, right? This molecule they call antigen A. On day one, right, that happens, and you start to make antibodies on like day 6. What happens between day 1 and day 6? You're sick. The bad guy's winning. Your white blood cells, the right white blood cells that match that antigen, haven't bumped into it yet, and so they haven't been kicked into gear. But once they get kicked into gear and make a whole bunch of antibodies, your helper T cells are also working then. Your cytotoxic T cells are also probably working, right? And you beat the bad guy. Your level of antibodies goes down, but you have a bunch of memory cells. And that's what makes the next time you bump into that same bad guy, the one with antigen A, that is what makes you take much less time to make much more antibodies. And so you don't even feel the effects of it like you did for those 5 days or so back here. That's what immunity is. But here's the specific part. Notice that this same point in time on this graph, they pretended that you bumped into a different bad guy. Well, a different bad guy means you got to start over. And here you got those 5 days when you're going to be sick from that different bad guy. And then eventually, hopefully, you'll get better from it. And then you'll be immune to it. Okay. Vaccines aren't that easy to make. So for HIV, a virus that we're going to feature in a second, in HIV, we have yet to be able to make a vaccine against HIV. Corona, they're working on a whole bunch of different vaccines for this virus, and it looks like pretty soon that we'll have a vaccine, hopefully, maybe even 2 or 3 different ones that have 2 or 3 different antigens that Corona has on it, right? Now, if we were in class, we'd talk about this a lot more because some people have a fear of vaccines that was planted in our society by a science paper that was very poorly done science, but unfortunately it took root and it still holds, and this is extremely unfortunate. If you can link to this, if not, you can Google up some things so that you can understand why this phenomenon of anti-vaccine, sentiment is out there. But it's quite dangerous, and we're having more and more and more measles outbreaks around the world because this is the vaccine that was mistakenly thought to cause autism. So if you can Google that up and look at it just for your own education, it'd be a good idea. Okay, so now back to the immunity, right? The kind of immunity you get not by kicking your own immune system into gear, but passively, all has to do with getting antibodies from somewhere else, right? But not memory cells. So your protection is not that great. It's the memory cells which really give the ability to, make a whole lot more antibodies and fight. But if you get some antibodies that will attach to this specific bad guy, that's going to help you. You get them naturally from mom in two different possible ways. One is those antibodies can cross the placenta to you before you're born, or they're also in mom's milk. Artificially, once we learned all this biology, we said, hey, what if we take somebody, maybe even an animal that's not a human animal, if we can get that antibody and give it to a person who's sick with this bad guy, that should help them. This is being done right now with corona, taking people that had corona, but it was a mild form, but they made antibodies against it, and taking their blood and taking that part called the plasma out. That's kind of like the liquidy part without the cells, but it has the antibodies, and giving that to people who have severe cases. So this is already being done for corona. So this is going to last a little while, but those antibodies aren't going to last forever. And without memory cells, again, this immunity is just a little bit. However, if you have this disease, which is the reason you are given these antibodies, right, your immune system is also kicking into gear. So by a combination of this little bit of passive help and your active immune response, hopefully you'll get all better. Okay, so this is not just bad guys that cause diseases that your immune system recognizes because of certain molecules, those antigens, but also any kind of foreign stuff, which might be tissue from another person, and blood is actually a type of tissue. It's a liquid type of tissue. And so getting blood from somebody else also has this possibility that your immune system will act against it, and when those antibodies stick to things, they clog things up. And if that happens with blood, then you have blood clot causing death kind of problems. And that's why if you need to get blood, you need to get the right type of blood. The types of blood that we talked about in heredity, type A, B, AB, and O, they all have to do with surface molecules, antigens on the surface of red blood cells that are simply called A, B, and AB antigens. What an allergy is connects to all this. An allergy is when something that's not really dangerous, like pollen can't cause you to be sick, but your body recognizes it as a bad guy, so to speak, and it triggers the inflammatory response and all that fluid, like runny nose fluid, a little bit of fever, all that kind of stuff that goes with your normal fight against bad guys. Remember, in this case, the non-specific kind. That can also be triggered by something that's really not harmful, like pollen. Then we have the case where some white blood cells that got receptors that would recognize your own cells as bad guys and attack them. Sometimes, unfortunately, that happens. We call these autoimmune diseases because the word auto means self, and this means your immune system is attacking yourself. Some common examples of these are rheumatoid arthritis, Arthritis is an inflammation of joints. One kind, this kind, is caused by your white blood cell attacking cartilage cells in your joints. And then you have a kind of diabetes that is also because the insulin producing cells in your pancreas are being attacked by your white blood cells. So now we're going to hit two specific viruses. These are the two most studied, most money spent on viruses in the history of human civilization. The first one was HIV. It was 1983 when we identified this virus. It had probably been around for about 50 years before that. What it does is it attacks your white blood cells, specifically the helper T cells, where it does its most damage. And so this has a receptor that causes it to latch onto your helper T cells. I know you can't see this picture too well, but these little tiny kind of blue dots here, that's the virus. This is your white blood cell. The virus is way, way smaller than any of your cells. So this is like still the deadliest virus going. It might take a while, but not many people at all can survive an HIV infection. But what happens here, which is quite dangerous, is kind of similar to this COVID corona thing, is that you can be infected, and for actually different reasons, you can carry this virus around for maybe a long time and not even know you have it, and therefore transmit it to other people. So in HIV's case, the death comes from the fact that it's knocking out your immune system. The helper T cells specifically are such important players. And then you die from some other kind of bad guy that you could normally fight, but now you can't fight it. So here's the two viruses in a diagram form for HIV, and here's a little computer generated coronavirus, which you're familiar with, right? They both have some very similar characteristics. RNA is their genetic stuff, but more importantly here really, they have a phospholipid bilayer membrane with proteins stuck in it that make it look very spiky, and these viruses both have that characteristic, which also requires them to be surrounded by water. Because just like a cell, these phospholipids won't stay together unless water is pressing them together, right, from both sides. That's why both of them require moisture. So HIV, in this case, since it doesn't infect lung cells, when you cough or sneeze, HIV won't come in your cough or sneeze. It's going to be more in your blood. But this coronavirus has a receptor here which can cause it to infect bunches and bunches of kinds of cells, because viruses infect cells very much in the same way that our immune cells, our white blood cells, recognize viruses because of molecules on their surface that match molecules on the surface of your cell. And what corona has is a molecule in one of those spikes, one of the spike molecules, that matches a molecule that is found on a whole bunch of different kinds of human cells. Whereas HIV has a molecule that can only latch onto certain kinds of cells like helper T cells. So coronavirus infection is much more widespread inside a person's body. It can infect kidney cells, brain cells, liver cells, really virtually almost every kind of cell, not just lung cells. So this is what I just said about HIV being a lot more specific, can only infect certain kinds of cells, and corona can fit onto a very common molecule found on lots of types of cells. And then because it can infect lung cells, and with every breath you take, some stuff from your lungs is coming out, right? The little water droplets that come out, especially when you cough, those little water droplets are holding coronavirus inside. And if that little water droplet comes up your nose or in your mouth, then that's the way it can be transmitted, unlike HIV, um, through the air. However, when it's in the air, this little droplet is also drying out, and it's especially good if the air is not humid like it is right now in May. So when this dries out, this thing is going to break up because its phospholipids need to be held together by water. So it's a good thing that it's dry.